My name is Philippa Pham Hughes. My age is 55, and my mother is Vietnamese. She was born in the north near Hanoi and had to escape the north in 1954 with many other families who were being threatened by communists. Our family had wealth and land, and so they were targets of communist redistribution of wealth. And so they had to leave the north under cover of night. They had to sneak out, just like many families had to sneak out in the middle of the night. They had to go to this, I guess you could probably just call it a refugee camp near the coast, and they had to wait there until American warships came to take them to the south. And my mom told me that when they were in that camp, maybe 2 or 3 months, they hardly had anything to eat. They had to eat rice and dried fish, and that was like all they had. And so finally an American warship came, and she was only 6 years old at the time. And so she had a hard time climbing up the ladder to go up to the boat. And so this American soldier carried her up there and gave her an orange. And it was like the first orange she'd eaten in months. And so she fell in love with this American soldier. He was very tall. I mean, everybody was tall to her when she was 6, but he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he had a big nose. And that's what she remembered for many years. And so that's really important to the story. I'll get back to that. But so our family was taken to the south. She was the youngest of, well, at that time there were 4 children traveling with my grandmother. 2 sisters, 2 of her oldest sisters got left behind in North Vietnam because they were married to communists, and so they had to stay behind. And then her oldest brother was serving in the military. Anyway, so she and 3 other siblings and her mother went to the south and rebuilt their lives in South Vietnam. And that was 1954. And then just a little over 20 years later, everybody had to leave everything behind again, just like many Vietnamese families, and they came to the US in 1975. So, she has like a very typical story in many ways for many of the people who fled north to south and then south to the US. But, like every family who did that, each family has their own unique story as well. So I was mentioning about the orange and this American soldier. She fell in love with that soldier, like her idea of that soldier, because she felt like he saved her and gave her this delicious orange. And so fast forward many years later, she was like a teenager, older teenager, like 16 or 17 or 18. And she had learned English. And so she would make money. One of the ways she made money was that she would help American bar girls write letters in English to, their American boyfriends. And then when those guys would write back, she would read the letter, translate the letters for the girls. And so one day she was in a bar. This is her story, who knows how much is true and how much is made up, but one day she was in the bar writing a bar, and this man walked in who had blonde hair and blue eyes and a really big nose. And so she's like, oh my God, she thought that was the man, except it wasn't, but he looked like the idea of this man who had saved her. And of course, that was my father. And so they started dating and eventually got married, the whole thing got it. And then they had me. So of course, my grandmother was very opposed to this marriage. I think for many reasons. I think that at some level, she's obviously a very traditional Vietnamese mother. So she at one level believed that Vietnamese people should marry Vietnamese people, like we should stay within our own culture and race. So a little bit it was like you can't marry outside of your race. That was a big part of it. Later, when I started doing more research, I realized that, I think some of her reluctance to, not just reluctance, she forbade my mother to marry this man. the reason was because at the time, only basically prostitutes and bar girls would marry a white person, an American soldier. He wasn't a soldier, he was actually quite a bit older. He was a civilian who worked for the military. He worked in communications, like setting up communication towers. So he wasn't even a soldier, but it didn't matter. It was the perception of doing things that she should not be doing. So I realized much later that was probably I know that was a big part of why she forbade my mother from marrying him. But my mom snuck off, literally snuck off, and married him anyway. And my grandmother actually, disowned her. And so my mother, again, she tells me these stories, who knows how much is true, but my mother said that her mother disowned her, and it was only when she had me and brought me home to meet her that my grandmother accepted her back in the family. So my mother credits me and my cute chubby cheeks with repairing her relationship with her mother. So that's sort of how my mom kind of generally met my dad. And it was because of her marriage to him that not only was she able to, she became an American citizen, I was born an American citizen. So, it was the advantage and privilege of having that allowed me to come to this country easily. All I had to do was get on an airplane and I was here, and then I could just go to school and no big deal. I was learning English from a very young, from English and Vietnamese were my two first languages. My mom says that, I can't speak Vietnamese now, but she said I could speak it equally as well as English. So, I'm very aware of what a privilege it was to be able to just easily come here, which was very different from the way the rest of our family came here. The rest of our family had to come through the refugee program that was in place right at the end of the war in April '75, when a little over 100,000 Vietnamese people came to this country through this program and then had to be dispersed to different refugee camps. So our relatives went to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and they had to go there for many months and learn, they were learning English. They had to be, do all the, paperwork, but they had to wait there until somebody or an entity somewhere in the country would sponsor them to come and live wherever that entity or family was. And those sponsors had to, their responsibility was to teach these new immigrants how to live in America, how to be Americans, how to get a job, how to use transportation, how to live here. And so our relatives got sponsored to Richmond, Virginia, and so by the Catholic Church. And so my mom moved us to Richmond to be near them so that our family, our families could be together. So for several years, our families, there are 4 siblings, she was one of 4. We all lived really close to each other. I could walk to my uncle's house and see my cousins. So that was really fun, actually. But eventually, all the families moved to different places. And so, once I graduated from high school in Richmond, I left and I never went back. But I did end up growing up in Richmond, me and my brother. And once all of our family left that area, my brother and I were the only Asian kids in our school for years until high school, when there was this a Korean brother and sister who went to the same high school. And it was so interesting because, this was the American South essentially. And so everything was either white or black, and there was nothing in between. And so I just remember this other Asian brother and sister and I, we would avoid each other. We couldn't, there just weren't enough of us to form a group, enough Asians. Plus we weren't even from the same Asian culture. And so we would just kind of avoid each other. And I think that in a lot of ways, we all 4 of us kind of just assimilated into white culture. We just essentially became white people. And I think that I never even, I mean, even when I went to college where there were more Asians of different kinds, I just never even had like a close Asian friend until relatively recently. I just had never lived like that. I'd just never grown up in a way where I even had Asian people around me to even be friends with. And then even when I did, I just didn't feel connected. So it was like very much later in life, like literally in the last 5 to 10 years, really, that I've really started connecting more with my Vietnamese side. I mean, I've always sort of dabbled. I've always loved Vietnamese food, like, of course, so delicious. And I've actually been to Vietnam as an adult 3 times. So I've always, been interested in learning. It was so amazing to go back to Vietnam and meet these relatives, many of whom look like me. Actually, like my aunt that got left behind just was like the exact replica of my grandmother who came to the US but then died here. And so when I saw her, when I first saw her in the street when we were driving up, like I thought I was seeing a ghost. And so it's just really interesting to like go to this whole other country and then see people that like literally looked like me. So so I started, I think that was the beginning of me feeling like more connected to my Vietnamese roots. But at the same time, whenever I was traveling around Vietnam, no Vietnamese people think that I'm Vietnamese. No Vietnamese people in the US think that I'm Vietnamese. Like they take one look at me and they're like, oh yeah, you're definitely at least half, but they don't even think I'm half Vietnamese. And then of course, because I can't speak the language, that puts another little barrier. And so in Vietnam, even just my size, like I was like so much taller and bigger than everybody. And so that always caused like a little bit of separation. I have some really great pictures of me with these relatives, like they're like second and third cousins or, one aunt twice removed kind of thing. And they're all like so tiny, but I can tell they're my relatives, So anyway, so there's like this sort of juxtaposition of like connectedness, but also, feeling like not quite part of it. So anyway, so that's something that as sort of a half Viet person, I've just always grown up with this feeling of not quite belonging anywhere. Culturally, I'm, like I said before, like I'm just definitely more, like white culture, whatever that means. But, who even knows what that means anymore, in a country that is just becoming more diverse and becoming more multicultural, more multiracial. So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, like for most of my life, being multiracial felt hard. But now it feels like, wait, like this face is the face of the American future. And like in a lot of ways, I wish I were, younger so I could sort of enjoy that. But, whatever. I just am really excited that it's sort of being recognized that this is what the future of America is. And, when we used to talk about the melting pot and the mixed salad, whatever, I don't think people really understood exactly what that meant. I mean, I think in fact, when people were saying things like the melting pot, like I think what that meant was like people would just assimilate into being white, to becoming as white as possible. Whereas I think the future is we're just kind of acknowledging all the differences, on all the diversities, and we just see that it's a kind of this beautiful melange. But, who knows? This is just my dream and my hope for the future of the country. But I've often thought about how, in Vietnam, kids who had mixed race for many years until the 80s were very much, they were called dust of the earth. If you were half Vietnamese and half white, you were called dust of the earth. You were the lowest of the low. You were the dust. And then I read that if you had a Vietnamese parent and a black parent, they called you burnt toast. And not in a nice, obviously that was like a very derogatory description. And, it's just kind of interesting how I keep thinking about what a privilege it has been to have grown up in this country for many reasons. But one, I'm so glad I didn't grow up as a, dust of the earth in Vietnam. But part of my research into my history, I found out that all those kids who were dust of the earth or burnt toast in the 80s became golden children, because that's when the US recognized that they should bring those children to America. Those were the children of Americans, and so they had the right to come to this country. And so those kids were, if they could prove it, and that's a whole other sort of racist story, but if they could prove it, they could come to this country. And so suddenly all those kids had like relatives that maybe they could bring with them. So anyway, I just think it's so interesting how the way we think about race, especially this idea of multi-race, and the way we think about these things, it can be so fluid, and it can really reflect what the cultural moment is what are the advantages of the cultural moment? And so I think, the way we talk about race today in America, just thinking recently about how Donald Trump was questioning Kamala Harris's Black and South Asian heritage, and how he was like so confused. And, when I hear stuff like that, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I would have been like so outraged and like angry about it, and what the hell, Nowadays, like when I hear stuff like that now, I just find it so absurd. Like it actually makes me literally laugh out loud, because I find it so absurd that people can still sort of fixate on this thing that is so fluid and is changing all the time. And like thinking about the way your face looks as it's some kind of indication of who you are and what it means is, I don't know, I just find it so hilarious, actually. And of course, I just have to caveat all that by saying, like, I get it. Like, I'm not I don't see color kind of person. Like, I get it. People do treat you in a certain way because of the way you look. I've experienced that throughout my whole life. Policies are made based on the color of your skin. Like, I get that. So I guess just the point that I'm trying to make is that it's just so absurd. I don't know. Anyway, so I've been thinking about it, how just it's become, I feel like it's becoming even more absurd, especially in a country where, in the 2020 census said that within basically one more generation, white people are going to be a minority in this country. I mean, that's the trajectory that this country is going in. And so I just find it so interesting that people are still talking about race in these very outdated, bizarre ways, bizarre to me ways. Well, okay, so I went off on a little bit of a tangent about race, but it's not really a tangent because, race, the way my face looks and the way I act, these have all been completely formative of who I am as a person. And so I think about it all the time. And I think about who I am all the time. And I think about, sort of those fundamental questions that, the Greeks said. I think about those fundamental questions that the Greeks said that we had to consider for ourselves. Who am I? What is my purpose? Where am I going? What happens to me when I die? Like, we have to consider those questions in order to become fuller, greater human beings. And race, identity, those are, those are essential to answering those questions. But, I think about race and identity all the time, but I'm not obsessed with it. Like, those things about me are one part of me. I'm also, I also like to surf. I also love to write. I love cats. So, I feel like there are so many parts of my humanity, and race and my Vietnamese culture are very important to me, but those are parts of me that make up the whole part of me. And so I've been kind of thinking more about how how to lean more into this idea of our humanity and like thinking about our humanity and our wholeness as humans above all else. And that's a lot of what my art practice focuses on right now, is thinking about how do we become flourishing humans? How do we create a world, an environment, a neighborhood, friend circles? How do we create the world that allows each of us to become flourishing human beings? And flourishing, like, what does that even mean to each of us? Like, you know, I think maybe the idea of flourishing can even mean something different to each person. But, you know, the way I think about it is based on this, I will say, a very inspirational essay that I read that really kind of summarizes how I think about flourishing. Was actually written by a political science professor, Jenna Bednar, at the University of Michigan. And she wrote a paper around flourishing and public policy and governance. You know, she's a political science professor. But I realized like a lot of her ideas around policy and flourishing can be applied to everything in life. How do we apply her ideas to every aspect of our lives? And so what she says is that we have to reorient our thinking about public policy away from the transactional toward the relational. We have to apply relational thinking to public policy and to governance. We have to think about how policy affects our relationships with each other, how we build our communities, how do we build better relationships with each other through public policy, through our governance. And I don't think she's saying that transactional stuff doesn't matter at all. We just never think about the relational. So how do we uplift the relational aspects to be at least equal to the transactional? We don't always have to make policy based on the return on investment, you know, or how many, you know, the metrics of it, you know, the physical metrics. She says that in order to create this flourishing policy, a more flourishing society, there are 4 pillars of flourishing: beauty, community, sustainability, and dignity. And so I have, you know, whenever I'm organizing any of the art projects that I organized lately in the last couple of years since I met her, I focus on those pillars and I say, how does this project address each of those pillars? How does this project improve our relationships with one another? And by doing that, we can at least we can lay a foundation for creating a more flourishing society, more flourishing for everyone, not just for me. So my art practice. I have had a hard time calling myself an artist, and even to this moment, it makes me feel uncomfortable, in part because the practice of art for me is so different from the way we traditionally understand art practice. People think about, when I say I'm an artist, people immediately say, oh, are you a painter or photographer or, you know, something like that, something that they recognize as art, stuff that hangs on the walls. And I think about art in a much more expansive way. I am a social practice artist. And as a social practice artist, my medium is conversations, relationships, and people. Those are the tools that I use to create an artwork. So let me go back a little bit and talk about how I got to this moment, and maybe it'll all make sense. And in a lot of ways, when I talk about my art practice, it requires me to really use a lot of words. And even in this moment right now, I'm having a hard time talking about it because, you know, I realize that like it's not an easy thing to explain in the sense that it often requires giving examples. Even more experienced social practice artists have different definitions even within the practice of what it means. So anyway, so let me back up. So, many years ago, I used to be a lawyer, as the child of an Asian immigrant. As many of you who are Asian immigrants will understand, my mother gave me 3 options: doctor, lawyer, or engineer. Dentist was okay. And a lot of my cousins actually are pharmacists, and so that's also acceptable. But, I just didn't even ever imagine that I could be an artist when I was growing up, even though I loved art so much. I loved going to art museums. I always loved to, I was always a writer. I always wanted to be a writer, actually, and so I was always writing things. And so but I had 3 options. And so I picked the one that I thought was like the easiest one. So I went to law school. And I did practice law for a little while. I was not very, I was very unhappy at practicing law. And I actually really liked law school though. And I think that kind of goes together with artistic life as well, because a lot of what learning about being a lawyer is about learning about how to solve problems and really observe the world and see where the problems are, and then trying to think of creative ways to solve those problems. So in a lot of ways, learning how to be a lawyer is a lot like the artistic practice. I think art, for me, really good artistic practice. Practicing law is a whole other thing. It's very boring. You end up, in one little area, one narrow area of law, and it just sort of starts to kill you with boredom. But okay, I digress. So I actually started out my professional life as a lawyer, and I was very, very bored. And so slowly I started transitioning into an art life. I didn't think about myself as an artist, but I was, at some point I started collecting art. But the real big moment was when I started hosting little salons in my home. I really wanted to just be around artists and art people. I just thought they were so cool. And so I started inviting them to my house for dinner, or not for dinner, but just to talk, have wine, just drink wine and talk about art and talk about ideas and philosophy. And oftentimes I would invite artists to come and bring their work and share it with us. And in a lot of ways that was kind of a precursor to the work that I'm doing now. But I was just doing it because I liked it. I thought of myself as like a modern day Gertrude Stein. And so those initial salons where I just was wanting to surround myself selfishly with art folk of all different kinds eventually led to me curating a couple really big art events. I mean, I'm going to use the word curating very loosely because I really did not know what I was doing. I just found this empty space and filled it with art and invited a bunch of people, and it was amazing. And it was kind of DC's version of, those loft parties you hear about in the 70s in New York, or something like that. So just doing things in raw spaces, just very DIY. The very first sort of big art event I organized was in this old retail shop. And, we put, my friend Ann and I, we put these, video screens in there with projectors, but, we plugged 4 different projectors into one outlet. We put in a little DIY bar, which was very illegal. And it just was so fun. And hundreds of people came. And this was, I can't quite remember the year, maybe it was 2006 or 7, before Facebook or, really in email newsletters, things like that. I don't know how people found out about it, but hundreds of people came. And we just started to realize there was a real hunger for different kinds of creative outlets that weren't just going to a museum. I love museums, or going to a gallery. I love galleries, but things that were just a little more accessible, that didn't feel even the least bit threatening. So I don't know, we did that first one. It was so big and successful that we just kept doing it over and over. And basically ever since then, I just kept organizing gatherings of people with art as the central focus of it. And I love art, I collect art, I'm surrounded by art and artists all the time, but it was really about the gatherings, about the connections that people were making because of the artworks, because of the artistic experiences that were happening. And it wasn't just physical objects. We were infusing, there was performance artists, musicians. I'm really into performance art and graffiti art, in part because they're sort of ephemeral art forms that you kind of have to experience in the moment, and then it disappears. You can never have that moment again. I'm really interested in that kind of experience that is very unique to that moment and to those people who just happen to be there in that moment. And you're just really sharing something that nobody else in the world can ever share, understand what it is because they weren't there. Really, that's something that kind of became part of the ethos of the work that continues to be part of the ethos of the work that I'm doing now, is how do we create this feeling of specialness in that moment. So I don't know, long story short is I just kept doing that over and over and trying different ways. I was organizing things for a handful of people, and then there were these events for 2,000 people, and just everything in between, and all different kinds of art forms, and just really experimenting, because not everybody can connect to, feels connected in a space with 2,000 people. And not everybody feels comfortable in a small one-on-one, So I was just trying to create different ways for people to find each other in kind of deeper, more meaningful ways. And just really thinking about how to really deepen those connections. Because we're in DC, we have a lot of superficial conversations here. And so I want to go deeper than that. And so that's what I was really trying to get at, what I've always been trying to get at. Organized hundreds of events over the last couple decades. And all of that kind of came together in 2016. I'm fast forwarding through a lot of things, but 2016 was a real pivotal year for many different reasons. But that election was very upsetting to me, as it was for many people of my ilk, and especially in DC, which is a very liberal, left-leaning city. And so my reaction to the results of that election, I was depressed, but also I was like, I've got to do something. And so my instinct was to invite people over for dinner. And so I invited Trump voters to my house for dinner, and I made dinner. I had 3 of them and 3 of us, so me and a couple liberal friends. And I made dinner. And basically, the second everybody came in the door, we just started arguing. But it was actually really fun in a weird way. People were respectful. I think in a way, that dinner took place less than a month after the election. And so I think in a lot of ways, people were still kind of shell-shocked at that moment. But it was really great. And so I realized, wow, maybe there's something in this. I wasn't trying to turn it into a project or anything, but I just kept over and over. I kept inviting folks over to my house to have just dinner and talk to each other and ask questions and try to understand where we were coming from, where the other side was coming from. But I also started experimenting again. I'm always experimenting, and because I really wanted those dinners to be good, to be really helpful to everybody who came. And so I started just trying to do different little things, just small things at first. Like I told people when they got to my place, they couldn't start talking about politics for 30 minutes. You could only talk about, getting to know you kind of things. Because, if you just start talking about politics right away, of course you're going to start debating. And I didn't want people to debate each other. I wanted people to know each other first. So again, I'll just fast forward, but because I just kept doing that over and over, and I kept learning each time. I'm not trained as a mediator or a facilitator, but so I started kind of self-teaching myself. I started reading all kinds of books. I started incorporating more artistic interactions into each of the dinners and conversations, and that was kind of fun to find out what kinds of things worked and what kinds of things didn't work. And eventually, I hosted one of these dinners in a small house museum here in DC called the Hyrick House Museum. And we invited 50 people from across the political spectrum to come to that dinner. And I kind of led people through a conversation that began with sort of trust building, relationship building first, and then became a conversation about politics. And it was awesome. People just left there saying, we have to do more of this. I felt like it too. That was in 2018. And one cool thing that happened from that dinner was that a person came to that dinner who worked for an organization that worked on immigration policy. And long story short is that organization basically funded a project called Looking for America, in which I traveled across the country organizing art exhibits in different locations around the country around the question of what does it mean to be American. And then I organized dinners in each of those spaces with 50 to 75. One dinner had 81 people at it. And these people represented the entire political spectrum. And they would respond, like they would look at the art, the artists would be there, they would like interact with the artists and then have dialogue with each other. And that was amazing. We did dinners and art exhibits in Anchorage, Alaska, El Paso, Texas, Sioux City, Iowa, all over the country. And it just really, I mean, I learned so much from just traveling around. But, you know, in every place, people were having conversations with each other in a deeply polarized country. I mean, we all know, like, we're deeply divided. We don't even geographically live near each other anymore. Like, it's very hard to have interactions with people that disagree with you anymore, even if you wanted to, but, you know, most people don't want to anymore because it's hard. But when given the opportunity, people really showed up, and they really showed up with open minds and a curiosity to learn about each other. It was really interesting to be able to create the space for people to come into. And I fully recognize that this was, you know, a very sort of artificial space that, you know, once they left the space, they were back in the real world that was very polarized. But for me, it still worked and still works to this day because it's a way to show people that it's possible, and it's a way to give people an opportunity to practice having those kinds of conversations so that they can do that again in the real, you know, in the real world. So those, you know, conversations happened all over the country. Those larger events with the art shows. Then a world pandemic hit, and that just shut everything down, obviously. But, you know, after, once things were starting to open up again, I got connected to the University of Michigan Museum of Art. And we did a really big dinner and series of art events at the museum, bringing people together into dialogue in advance of the 2022 midterms. And that was just so incredibly successful. People were so jazzed about being able to participate in these dialogues, but also seeing it as, you know, a form of civic engagement. Like, not, you know, being part of these conversations was being part of our civic life. In fact, sometimes I think that just having these conversations is, these days at least, it's like one of the most revolutionary things we can even be doing, given the way we are so deeply divided. That project led to an even bigger project that's happening right now in advance of the 2024 election, in which I am the visiting artist for art and civic engagement at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. And we're doing a whole semester's worth of programming around bringing people together into these dialogues. And I'll also be teaching a class at Michigan on, you know, how to create these kinds of spaces for dialogue. Because, you know, it's having meaningful conversations isn't just about putting people in front of a bunch of food and telling them to turn off their cell phones. Like, there are sort of skills involved. They're easily learned skills, but somewhere along the way, we seem to have like forgotten how to do this sort of thing. And so my goal is just to create those spaces so that people can relearn those skills or learn them if they, maybe they just never learned them in the first place. But like re-engage with those skills and then practice. And that's why, one of the reasons why I'm really excited about what we're doing at Michigan, because we're actually going to be doing weekly programming, weekly meals in the art gallery, in which people will have multiple opportunities to practice and to keep talking to people who are not like them, who don't think like them, who don't necessarily vote like them. And one of the things that I really want to impress on the people who come to these dialogues and to anybody who's listening is that I've really moved away from this idea of finding common ground. I think that you may never find common ground, and I think that's okay. The whole purpose of these conversations is to just understand each other, understand where we're coming from, and understand the sort of human element of how we start believing, how we develop the beliefs that we have about the world. Because even when people have ideas that you think are the craziest ideas, there's a reason why those ideas came from somewhere, and they always come from some sort of experience of the way you've lived in your life, the way you were raised, where you were raised, how you were raised. So we need to understand all of that so that we can sort of start building on the relationships that come from seeing each other as real human beings, and from the sharing that happens when we share at this sort of very deep and vulnerable level that builds the relationships that are necessary to creating the changes in the world that will help create a society that make it possible for all of us to flourish together. But it's absolutely not about changing anybody's mind. It's not about coming to some kind of shared agreement. It's just about seeing our differences and reveling in those differences, and seeing how those differences can come together to create something bigger and better for all of us. And so that is my art practice, is creating the spaces where that kind of relationship building and dialogue can happen. And art is a way to create that space. The art practice is, the artwork is that conceptual space that I've created for those relational conversations. So, this is how, by example, I have to give you an example to explain how this works. So at Michigan, I've been given a gallery space. And so that gallery space has become the artwork. So in fact, I try not to use the word curated in this particular instance, because it's not really about curating. Curating, traditional curating would be like, I picked a bunch of art and we hung it on the walls and we had a conversation about it. What's happened is I've transformed this gallery almost into my own living room. I've commissioned wallpaper that contains the 50 state flowers. A local, a Detroit artist, painted each of the 50 state flowers, and then we turned that into wallpaper that covers every surface of this gallery. We're creating different living room spaces, small conversational living rooms in the space, and then there's an actual dining room in the gallery. And then all these other sort of interactive elements that will be happening that will invite people into the space to have dialogue. People are going to be able to bring food and drink into the gallery, which took a lot of doing to convince the museum to allow food and drink in, because as you know, food and drink are generally forbidden in art museums. So, this is going to be a very special space that will hopefully look and feel very different from any other kind of space you've ever been in inside of a museum. And because you'll feel something different, my hope is that you'll feel inspired to think a little differently and to interact with people a little bit differently in this space. So once again, just always experimenting. And I think a lot of social practice art is just about experimenting to see what can work and what will appeal to people to help bring them together.